It's the final game of the Duos Cash Cup final, and there are two teams in contention to win it all, Queasy and Vino and Thomas and Malibuca. Whoever does better in this game wins the whole tournament, and it comes down to the wire at the end. But let's go back to the beginning of the game in order to get there. Queasy and Vino land at Kenjutsu Crossing, while Thomas and Malibuca land at the racetrack. Both teams begin to loot up their respective drop spots, with Queasy and Vino deciding to carry an MK, Havoc, Bigs, Minis, and a flare gun, while Thomas and Malibuca are carrying the same loadout, except for instead of a flare gun, they are carrying med mists and slap juices. At this point, both teams are looking for their next objective, Storm Surge. Queasy and Vino find some of their early surge by finding a fight and third-partying it from two different angles. They then use this early surge to wrap towards the western edge of the safe zone, while in the zone, and Queasy ends up finding an exotic Maven shotgun to replace his Havoc. Going back to Thomas and Malibuca, they find a quick beam onto a duo to get their surge before playing for a cash. While playing on this cash, they might be thinking about how they're only 7 points or just 2 eliminations behind the first place team, but they were also thinking about trying to get surge because Thomas was constantly looking for surge while claiming the cash, and Malibuca tried to claim a hill to look for even more surge before being pushed off by a full duo. They then rotate through the jungle to get off the edge of the third zone, and they both use the Mud Warrior augment and the Slurp plants to trade Storm Surge with all of the teams around them. Moving back over to Queasy and Vino, we see them start to struggle in the third zone. They start to get held as they try to rotate into the fourth zone. Fortunately, this team knows how to look for rotates where they can use the terrain as a way to block their enemy's line of sight. This allows them to get into the fourth zone, but they have an even further fifth zone rotation to make. It is starting to look really bad for Queasy and Vino, but they are able to get a good chunk of their shield back from the many Slurp plants in the jungle. They make it into the fifth zone, and they thankfully pull a very close sixth zone. This team uses med mists that they picked up in the mid game to run into the zone, and they use these med mists to get very deep into the dead side of the zone before any other teams, but a new problem is beginning to rise for them: Storm Surge. This team is well below the Storm Surge threshold, and because they have positioned themselves on the side of the zone with less players on it, this means that it could be very difficult for them to find the necessary damage. But thankfully, Vino was able to get a huge spray out to other players on the dead side and save their game. But let's check back in on what Thomas and Malibuca have been doing during this time. This team started to make their fifth zone rotate, and they farmed up their materials along the way. They then saw an old build fight and decided to base on top of it in order to give themselves some amazing sightlines over the entire lobby. They sit in this base for a while, and then when they have to make their sixth zone rotation, they just make a simple rotation onto the edge of the sixth zone. This rotate puts them in a lot of congestion though, and it could make their 7th zone rotate much harder, but they are able to get a relatively easy rotation into the 7th zone when they wait for the two teams below them to start fighting, so they can use this small timing to give themselves a free rotation. This rotation was free for the most part until the very end, where they got sprayed and they had to stop and heal before using a pretty large amount of metal to get into the 7th zone. The 8th zone pulls close to them, and they make their rotation by going up and over the mid ground and just blocking off the high ground when they start to look at them. This makes their 8th zone rotation incredibly easy, and once they were in the zone, they looked for some eliminations on the players below them, but let's see what Queasy and Vino are up to at this point. Queasy and Vino are already on the dead side of the 6th zone, so this made their 7th zone rotation incredibly easy, as they could just hug the dead side of the zone. Just as they were finishing this rotation, they found Tripperin, who was alone, and they decided to fight this by setting up a quick pinch where Queasy distracted him on his walls, which allowed Vino to jump into Tripperin's box to finish off the elimination. This team then pulled an extremely close first moving, which they quickly get into, and Vino notices that Chari isn't paying attention, and he is able to get the wall onto him and take a 2v1 aim duel, which they win, setting themselves up even better for the endgame. They continue to look for kills in the 8th zone, as these points are incredibly valuable in separating them further from Thomas and Malibuca. They go for a pre-edit play onto the surrounding teams, and Vino is able to get a knock, but is also traded back extremely hard. With these kills, this team is set up well to dominate this endgame, but it would all collapse as they start to spray height at the start of the 9th zone, but they were in too much congestion, and another team was able to take advantage of Queasy and Vino's distracted nature, and they double sprayed and eliminated Queasy, leaving Vino alone to solo clutch. But before we see how Vino will solo clutch, let's check back in on Thomas and Malibuca. This team makes an easy mudsliding rotate along the low ground, and they quickly use this extra speed to get to the front side, where they ramp up and they start to look at the high ground. While looking at the high ground though, their builds get shot out as they're massively underconnected while going for this play. This chaos resulted in Malibuca going down and Thomas being very scuffed on materials. Now the race for first place is on the backs of 2 solo clutches. Vino starts his own solo clutch out by quickly getting into the edge of the zone before making a 2x1 to use his minis. He then looks at some minor attempts to take height before realizing that it isn't happening right now, at least, as he gets chopped out, but he is able to quickly get back to the front side of 2x1 and mini again. He starts to tarp through the left side of the zone on the third moving and gets jumped on by a duo, and he plays this 1v2 almost perfectly. Vino instantly goes for a timing shot as this duo tries to jump on him. He then uses his tarp to create a right shoulder peek, and when one of the players from the duo jumps into his box, he instantly gets out of the box, and he is able to get a big shot onto the other player. Finally, Vino was able to isolate a 1v1, but despite hitting a large shot himself, he wasn't able to take out this player here and died at 403 points, the number that Thomas would have to clutch to. Thomas has 14 builds to his name, and he needed 28 more points to catch up, so he knew he couldn't just go into the safe zone and die when he ran out of mats. He needed to make something happen. So Thomas looked at his inventory and used the one resource he did have: white health. Thomas, knowing that he had a ton of slurp juices in med mist, decided to go into the zone to give himself just a little bit more time to make something happen. Thomas is able to find some extra materials in the zone and uses these to claim the low ground in the 10th zone before jumping back into the zone on the 11th zone as he gets closer and closer to 403 points. Thomas works his way back into the low ground on the 11th zone, and he's so close to 403 points. Can he get it? And unfortunately, he was just short, only missing out on the first place by 1 point. But if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll love the video where I look at 10 different fights from the most recent solo cash cup and rate them as either good or bad, so we can learn what to do and what not to do in our fights. So let's go.